The Heckscher Ohlin theorem is based on the resources and trade, the possibility or the potential for trade, and it is felt that trade will affect the demand for resources, hence the price of those resources would be affected due to trade. In this module, we will try to analyze the effect of international trade on the factor earnings of the factors which are producing those commodities which are traded. This would also affect the income distribution amongst two nations, that is, over a long period of time when trade takes place, then this is likely to affect the income distribution pattern across nations, because through trade the demand for those factors increase which are engaged in trade. Paul Samuelson developed a natural consequence of the Heckscher Ohlin theorem, and this is known as the factor price equalization theorem. This factor price equalization theorem examines the effect of trade on the relative factors demand and the relative prices of factors, holding the assumptions of the Heckscher Ohlin theorem as being true. The Heckscher Ohlin theorem examines the role of resource differentials in international trade. It shows that the comparative advantage is influenced by the interaction between the resources of an economy that predetermines the relative factor abundance and the technology of production, which determines the relative intensity with which the factors of production are used in production, and all of this put together tells us about the pattern of trade or international specialization. Since the Heckscher Ohlin theory emphasizes the interaction of and the interrelationship between proportion, that is factor proportions, which differ amongst different productions, that is production of different commodities, and when different factors of production are available in different countries and the proportions, the factor proportions are also different, then this results in the production of different goods in terms of international specialization, and therefore this Heckscher Ohlin theorem is also known as the factor proportions theory.
After studying this module, you shall be able to know the extensions of HO theorem, analyze the effect of international trade on the relative price and income of various factors of production, and learn who gains from trade and who loses. You shall be able to understand the meaning of gains from trade when there are losers, and evaluate the results of empirical tests of HO model. Let us now discuss the factor price equalization theorem. From the general equilibrium framework of HO model, we learnt that the price of factors and technology together determine the final commodity prices, and factor prices in turn are determined by their relative supply in that country. This means that in the absence of trade, nation 1, labor abundant country, will have a lower relative price of good A than nation 2 because of the relative price of labor, or the wage rate is lower in nation 1. Similarly, capital owners in nation 2, the capital abundant nation, earn less than capital owners in Nation 1. Now, as the two nations decide to trade, they specialize in the production of goods of their comparative advantage, and this causes a convergence in their factor prices and hence relative prices. Factor prices converge with relative prices after trade. Thus, when HO theory holds, then factor price equalization will also hold. According to factor price equalization, free trade leads to convergence of relative prices of factors involved, along with convergence of relative prices of goods. This happens because when two countries trade with each other, then, along with exchange of goods, there is an indirect exchange of factors of production. Nation 1 allows the other nation to use its abundant factor not by selling its abundant factor, but by trading goods produced with high ratio of its abundant resource than its scarce resource. Through this indirect way of trading factors of production, factor prices get equalized. As Nation 1 specializes in production of good A, the labor-intensive commodity, it will require more resources, that is, labor and capital. The resources will come from the capital-intensive product, whose production will decrease with specialization in good A. The capital-intensive product will release relatively more capital and less labor than is being demanded by the expanding production of the labor-intensive product. The consequence is an excess demand for labor and an excess supply of capital. The excess demand for labor will cause the wage rate to increase, and the excess supply of capital will cause the price of capital to decrease. The conclusion is that in a labor-abundant country, trade will cause the price of labor to increase and the price of capital to decrease. In a capital-abundant country, the reverse reallocation occurs. The demand for capital will increase and that of labor will decrease, creating excess demand conditions for capital and excess supply conditions for labor in Nation 2. So, trade will cause the price of capital to increase in a capital abundant country and cause the price of labor to decrease. Let us summarize the factor price equalization theorem. International trade will cause wages to rise in Nation 1, the relatively low wage nation, and to fall in Nation 2, the relatively high wage nation, thus reducing the pre-trade difference in wages between the two nations. Similarly, return price to capital, that is, R interest rate, will rise in Nation 2 and fall in Nation 1, thus reducing the pre-trade difference in R between the two nations. However, trade not only reduces the difference in the return to factors of production, but would bring about a complete specialization in relative factor prices. The international trade will keep expanding until the relative commodity prices and hence relative factor prices are completely equalized. The optimal choice of input that producers will actually choose depends on relative cost of labor and capital. If wages are higher relative to rent, then producers prefer to use more capital relative to labor. Thus, the theorem can be stated as international trade will bring about equalization in the relative and absolute returns to homogeneous factors across nations. That is, homogeneous labor will earn the same wages in all trading nations, and homogeneous capital will earn the same interest rate in all trading nations. In other words, factor intensities between two goods are different. That is, one good is labor intensive and the other good is capital intensive, and the factor intensities between two countries are same. That is, one good is labor intensive in both countries and the other good is capital intensive in both countries. The definition of factor intensity depends on ratio of capital to labor, and it does not depend on ratio of capital to output. It means a good cannot be labor intensive and capital intensive both. Since this theorem follows directly from HO theorem and is developed by Paul Samuelson, this theorem is also referred to as Heckscher Ohlin Samuelson HOS theorem. The diagram shows the working of the factor price equalization theorem. When trade occurs on the basis of factor endowments, then in nation 1, wage rises and interest rate falls, while at the same time in nation 2, wage falls and interest rate rises. This leads to a rise in relative wage rate in nation 1 and a fall in relative wage rate in nation 2. These two combine to give equilibrium wage rate W by R. In this diagram, the relative price of labor W by R is plotted on the horizontal axis, and the relative price of commodity 1 P good A upon P good B is plotted on the vertical axis. Here we assume that since both trading nations operate using the same technology, the commodity prices are determined completely by factor prices. Prior to trade, nation 1 is at point A with W by R1 and P good A upon P good B is equal to PA. Nation 2 is at point PB with W by R2 and P good A upon P good B is equal to PB. Since we are measuring in terms of labor capital ratio, nation 1 W by R is lower than nation 2 and hence PA is lower than PB. As nation 1 specializes in production of good A, it causes W to rise and R to fall, causing W by R to rise. On the other hand, simultaneously in nation 2, the specialization in good B will cause R to rise and W to fall, causing R upon W to rise or W upon R to fall. The movement of W upon R in both nations is shown through arrows. This movement continues till they reach point A dash is equal to B dash, at which P A dash is equal to P B dash and W oblique R is equal to W oblique R star in both nations. At this point, W by R is identical in both nations and resources and will have no incentive to move from one country to another. Hence, trade causes a convergence of relative prices. However, not only relative prices but absolute prices also get equalized. Given that trade equalizes relative factor prices and perfect competition exists in both commodity and factor markets, and that both nations use the same technology and face constant returns to scale, trade will also lead to equalization of the absolute returns to homogeneous factors. Hence, not only W oblique R1 is equal to W oblique R2, but also W1 is equal to W2 and R1 is equal to R2. Moving on, let us discuss trade and the distribution of income. In the previous section, we analyzed the effect of trade on factor prices. Now we will see how this change in factor prices and hence returns to them affect the distribution of income within each nation. In other words, the change in the relative prices has important significance on the distribution of income. That is, it has a strong effect on the relative earnings of workers and landowners. The factor price equalization theorem demonstrates that an increase in the relative price of a commodity raises the return of the factor used intensively in its production. Thus, the labor abundant country will see an increase in wages but a fall in the return to capital. Specifically, real income of labor W rises in nation 1 and real income of owners of capital R fall in nation 2, while the capital abundant country will experience the opposite pattern of change, that is, rise in income of owners of capital and fall in income of labor. Hence, owners of a country's abundant factor gains from trade, but owners of a country's scarce factor loses. Thus, international trade causes a redistribution of income from the relatively expensive or scarce factor to the relatively cheap abundant factor. International trade will benefit that factor of production with which the country is abundantly endowed. Since developed nations are expected to be capital abundant, therefore, following the opening of trade, the return to capital in the developed countries is expected to increase and wages are expected to fall. This pattern of change worsens inequality in the developed countries. That is why labor unions in developed countries generally favor trade restrictions. In such cases, a proper redistribution policy is required which can provide relief to labor. Now we will discuss the distribution of income in the short run. If the HO theorem holds true, then it does not depend on which industry employs them. Workers earn the same wages in the production of good X and Y, and capital receives the same interest rate in both good X and Y. However, in the real world, factors earn quite different amounts in different industries because it takes time for factors to move between industries, that is, they are immobile in the short run. Only in the long run, when there is enough time for resources to move between industries, will earnings be equalized again. In short run, factors are specific. This difference in short run and long run is very important for understanding income distribution effect. Suppose that international trade leads to a decrease in relative price of good X, capital intensive good. In the long run, This is good for capital owners and bad for workers. But in the short run, owners of capital that are currently used in good X production may suffer, while workers currently employed in good Y may gain. Such short-run gains and losses determine political economy of trade. Now we will discuss the empirical testing of HO model, Leontief paradox. Since Heckscher Ohlin model is one of the most celebrated theorems in international economics, it has been subject to extensive empirical testing. The first and foremost piece of evidence has been provided by Wassily Leontief in 1951 using US data for the year 1947. Leontief paradox is the single biggest piece of evidence against the factor proportions theory. Let us look into the empirical results of the paradox. The United States has been a special case among countries until recently. The US was, until a few years ago, much wealthier than other countries, and their workers visibly worked with more capital per person than their counterparts in other countries of the world. Even now, although some Western European countries and Japan have caught up, the US continues to be high on the scale of countries as ranked by the capital labor ratios. HO theory of international trade is one of the most influential ideas in international economics. Therefore, it has been a subject matter of extensive empirical testing. The most important empirical testing was done by Leontief on US data. Leontief supposed correctly that in 1947 the United States was abundant in capital relative to its trading partners. Thus, from the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, Leontief expected that the United States would export capital-intensive goods and import labor-intensive goods. To test the hypothesis, he calculated the amount of labor and capital in a representative bundle of $1 million worth of US exports and import substitutes for the year 1947. Leontief used the numbers in this table to test the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Each column shows the amount of capital or labor needed to produce $1 million worth of exports from or imports into the United States in 1947. What Leontief actually found, however, was just the opposite. US import substitutes were more K intensive than US exports, that is, the capital labor ratio for US imports was higher than the capital labor ratio found for US exports. This finding contradicted the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. In the same study, Leontief tried to defend the HO theorem rather than rejecting it. He argued that US labor is 3 times as productive as foreign labor, and US will become a labor abundant nation if we multiply labor force by 3 and HO theorem will hold correctly. However, later he himself withdrew the explanation, citing that US capital is also 3 times as productive as foreign capital, which then multiplied by 3 would result in the same ratio. Hence, the contradiction remained, and this came to be called Leontief's paradox. Now we will discuss the explanation of the paradox. There are many possible explanations given for the Leontief paradox, which puts up the question, is the paradox real? The possible source of the Leontief paradox bias could be due to the following reasons. US and foreign technologies are not the same. in contrast to what the HO theorem and Leontief assumed. Use of a two-factor model. By focusing only on labor and capital, Leontief ignored land abundance in the United States. Leontief should have distinguished between skilled and unskilled labor because it would not be surprising to find that US exports are intensive in skilled labor. 1947 being a non-representative year. The data for 1947 may be unusual because the World War II had just ended 2 years earlier. Countries were engaged mainly in post-war reconstruction. When Leontief repeated his study, taking 1951 year data, he found that the US exports were only 6% more labor intensive than 30% earlier. Though the paradox did not eliminate, but the intensity was significantly reduced. The United States was not engaging in completely free trade as Heckscher Ohlin theorem assumed. Most heavily protected industries in the US were labor intensive, reduced imports and increased domestic production of L-intensive goods. The most important source of bias was ignorance of human capital, education, job training, and skills, and only physical capital was included as capital. Kennan, in a 1956 study, estimated the human capital embodied in US exports and import substitutes, and then recomputed K/L for US exports and US import substitutes of the 1947 data, and he succeeded in eliminating the Leontief paradox. Bowen, Leamer, and Sveikoskas tested the Heschler-Ohlin model on data from 27 countries and 12 factors of production and confirmed the existence of the Leontief paradox at an international level also. Tests on manufacturing data between low, middle-income countries and high-income countries. This data lends more support to the theory. However, there has been some empirical support for the HO theory, which is provided by North-South trade. For example, trade between US and South Korea justifies HO theory because while US exports sophisticated skill-intensive products, South Korea largely exports products not involving sophisticated technology.
Thus, this module can be summarized in the following manner. If the relative prices of goods increase, then the real wage rate of return of the factor of production used intensively in the production of that good also increases proportionately, while the real wage or the rate of return of other factors reduce in a relative sense. So, therefore, if one country is producing a labor intensive commodity and exporting it, then over a period of time when trade takes place between two nations, then the demand for labor would increase in the first country which is exporting the labor intensive commodity, and the wage rate would increase. Now, if the wage rate increases, wage rate is increasing in relation to the rental price of capital. So, the factor price ratio is going or tilting in favor of labor and against capital. International trade has the power, has the tendency to equalize therefore the return to different factors. Okay. Initially, in our example, labor that is the wage rate was depressed in the first country, but slowly what will happen is that the factor price ratio will go in favor of labor and against capital. So, as this process goes on in international trade, through international trade, there would be a sense of equalization of the returns to different factors of production, and this would lead to a homogenization of factors of production across the nations. This is the gist of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. The model predicts that the owners of abundant factors gain, but the owners of scarce factors lose out with trade. Trade produces both losers as well as winners, but the country with on a whole will be better off with trade, even though the model predicts that the owners of the scarce factor would be worse off without compensation. In the short run, some factors may be immobile, and hence trade fails to equalize the returns to the factors. The first empirical test was conducted by Leontief in 1947 by employing the data from the United States. The US imports were ironically found to be 30% more capital intensive than the US exports. Now, USA being a capital intensive country, we would actually expect the reverse, and this is known as the Leontief's paradox. It was not in accordance with the factor proportions theorem. Various possible explanations have been provided which lend support to the original results of the Heckscher Ohlin theorem, and there is an attempt to solve the paradox. One of the explanations is that the theorem has been ignoring human capital. That is, that if we treat the factor of production as labor, then we are not making a distinction between labor and human resource. Human resource is actually human capital, and there is a process by which over time the efficiency, the capabilities of human beings increase, and therefore the Heckscher Ohlin theorem, it does not explain or it's not able to explain the Leontief paradox. If we incorporate the human capital development which has taken place over the years, maybe this anomalous pattern of trade could be explained. The empirical support for the Heckscher Ohlin theorem was weak, except in the case of involving trade between high income countries and developing or low income countries. In general, the support was found to be weak in the case of Heckscher Ohlin theorem. It was found to be true only where there were stark differences between the trading partners, with one being highly capital intensive and the other being highly labor intensive. So, in its extreme form, the Heckscher Ohlin theorem was able to explain the trade patterns, but at the same time it left certain anomalies which were captured by the Leontief's paradox. There was a subsequent attempt to reconcile the Heckscher Ohlin theorem with the Leontief's paradox, which takes into account the importance of human capital.